because this man truly is an artist. He's taken some of the most remarkable photographs of these four very special men. Please welcome Robert Freeman.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and those who aren't. What I'm going to present tonight visually is a sequence of images from the book that's coming out, but basically it's all the material, the best material I took of the Beatles from August '63, when I first went down to meet them on my own initiative. After having spoken to Brian Epstein and sent them some photographs. And then from that meeting, which was supposed to be just a couple of days doing portraits, it led to an association that lasted over 3 years. And so for me, it was a kind of a hobby that I did over that period of time, because I was doing other kind of work as well, fashion photography, reportage, etc. Now, to begin at the beginning, when I first went down to meet them at this hotel on the south coast of England, a couple of days, no, I think the next day, George Martin called Brian Epstein and said, look, we urgently need a photograph for the new album cover, which the album was going to be called With the Beatles, Meet the Beatles in America. So Brian said to me, do you think there is anything you can do? Do you have an idea? Well, I did have an idea, and it was based on a photograph that I had done earlier that year, which is I've included in the book under a section for the record, so that people can see what the source of this image was. Now, I know it looks as if it was taken in a coal cellar or a studio with a dark background, but in fact, it was taken in the dining room of the hotel at which they were staying, where there was a big window light and a dark curtain that could be drawn round behind. So it was a very simple production. It was me. I put film in the camera. I put the camera on a tripod. I used a telephoto lens for one purpose. That was so that all the heads would be more or less the same size. They are. But I didn't want a line of them, because it wouldn't have fitted into the square format of the album. So that since Ringo was the last to join the group and was the smallest, I said, why didn't you go down in the bottom right-hand corner? And Ringo, being a very cooperative sort of guy and a musician, had to bend his knees to get down, a little bit more down, Ringo, down, a bit down. Down, Ringo. Now hold it. Same look as the rest. And so I wanted a photograph that where they all had more or less the same expression. It wasn't a smiling pop star album cover. It was black and white or blue and white, where they all have a uniform look, but the difference in character is a difference in their faces. So I felt I wanted to give uniformity to them as a group. They're four square, and but a difference in the look of their faces. So that was basically the intention. And I'd even proposed to the record company that they use the album without any titling, not even putting the Beatles on the cover, because by that time they were pretty well known and the wave of Beatlemania had already started. So I think with that it would have been a totally original album cover. Well, you'll see other album covers later, but before I go any further, I would just like to let you hear the beginning of the audio part of this presentation. And when I first saw them live on stage, as the gentleman before said, they didn't move around, they only moved to the mic or to the other mic to join each other for vocal harmonies. There was no dance animation, no flashing lights, just a very simple presentation. But when you listen to the energy of Paul McCartney singing Long Tall Sally, opening the concert, you'll catch the feeling that I caught then and caused me to stay on more than a few days, and it led to an association that lasted for 3 years. So let's hear the beginning of the audio. Well, I thought you should really hear the Beatles as they sounded in concert at that time, so you can imagine the kind of energy they generated. And I left this image on at the end because these 3 girls, like there were 3 Graces here I recently met, were very great fans of the Beatles, and one of them wrote me a letter a couple of years ago. She's a librarian, the one on the left, saying, we were the earliest fans of the Beatles, and they used to queue up and sleep overnight in the queues outside the theaters, cinemas at that time as well, to be able to get tickets to go in. So, in a sense, this talk is dedicated to the Beatles fans and is reflected in this image of August 1963. Next image, and keep the sound. Up the sound a bit. Okay, this is Paul in his dressing room, being anguished at having to sign more autographs, more autographs, more autographs. Beatlemania began in late '63. The dressing rooms were very small in cinemas then. Big pot of tea, a boot, and clutter. They always used to sit at the end or in the corner because there were too many people and too little space. John's favorite was Twist and Shout, then as a performance number live. George in the makeup studio of a TV station. This is John Lennon, and he was always fooling around and saw in the makeup room this hat and beard, so he put them on, and I took the shot into the mirror of the dressing room. This is from a chapter called Waiting for Playback. I called it Waiting for Playback because recording music involves recording music, but it also means a lot of waiting around to hear the results of what you've recorded. And so after being there a few times, I realized that there was more waiting around than actual performing, especially for Ringo, because he would lay down the drum tracks first and then have to wait as the others laid over the other tracks. So this is Paul waiting, listening maybe from George up. George Martin was up in a console high up in the Abbey Road studios. George Martin with John in 1963 recording the With the Beatles album. John with his Buddy Holly look. Lennon and McCartney in 63. You'll see an image later where you see a different technology, because the technology developed over the 3 years, and I think with the increasing sophistication of music recording, it got them more interested in studio than in live concerts, where you didn't always have the sound quality you required, nor could you even hear your music properly because of either the response from the audience or the bad playback systems. Jingle, Ringo for me was one of my favorites. He was the most handsome of the four of them and was the easiest to photograph. And I think he was a significant contribution to the success of the Beatles, especially on the first visit to America, because I think his attitude, his looseness, his smile was the sunshine behind the group. Also, he was the only one who could dance, and I watched him dancing with Ronnie of the Ronettes in the Peppermint Lounge when they cut loose and put on some music to dance to. Ringo was up on the floor with Ronnie straight away. A serious man, but I think some of the Beatles' humor got a hold on him. This shows the sophisticated technology they were using to record with the Beatles. I think it's called a 4-track sound system, and it looks like the 19th century Jules Verne visions of the future. But the music came out good. Borrowed the boots for one night because I kept seeing these boots around in the dressing room and saw the names inside the boots, which you can probably just see on the projection. And it's Mr. George, John, Paul, etc. Because imagine eight boots loose in the dressing room. Which one is mine? So they had the names on. So I got interested in the boots and borrowed them for one night because I was doing advertising work and did it like an advertising shot, a still life, as they say, of boots that had more than still life inside them. As you can see, this was taken in Stockholm because the wall of the parapet is out just outside the town hall. I went with them to Stockholm at the end of '63 for a brief promotional weekend, and there was no room at the hotel, so I had to share a room with John Lennon, and like kids, when the lights were out, we were just talking to each other across the beds. Brian Epstein, the book I'm doing, I've just completed, and it's coming out this year, called, I don't know what it's called. It's called, it's a publisher here. The book's called The Beatles, A Private View, Robert Freeman. Now, I really liked working with Brian. He had a gentlemanly attitude, a quiet sense of humor, and a dignified style. And we'd just been having tea in a department store in London. We're walking through the furniture department. I saw this chair. I said, Brian, sit in the chair for one moment. So he's there with his newspaper. Click, click, finish. On, out of the store. So this just captures a moment. And he really made the Beatles. Thank you, Brian. Brian waiting nervously with Ringo, who doesn't look nervous, who is about to be married, Brian being the best man. And this was the cover I designed and photographed for Brian Epstein's biography, which came out quite early for a manager who just started. It was in 1964, and John, being wittily playful and very ironic, and knowing Brian's, say, sexual disposition, said it should have been called A Cellar Full of Boys. Typical John. I mean, he just couldn't not help. He couldn't not do it, not say it. These were the photographs that I first sent to the Beatles when they were in Wales on their first tour. So I was doing black and white photography of jazz musicians before I met the Beatles, plus black and white street photography. So black and white was a natural medium for me to use for the first cover with the Beatles, Meet the Beatles. And I wanted something that was a breakaway from the regular pop color album cover. So these were the first photographs they saw. And this is me backstage with John Coltrane, who is a well-known saxophonist, and Santana is a great fan of Coltrane. Coltrane's his god. So I'd worked with very high-level musicians. This was in '61, even before meeting the Beatles in '63. These two pages, this is one page, and the next page shows a selection of work that I was doing before I even met the Beatles. So in a way, technically, I was prepared professionally to work quickly with them under different circumstances, either producing the first album in black and white with natural light in half an hour, or producing the animated photographs for the Hard Day's Night, or shooting in color in a London park at the end of the day without any flash, any lights, any production. So I wanted to show in the book the kind of work that I had done just before, well, over the 2 years before meeting the Beatles. And the bottom photograph on the left is the prototype for the Meet the Beatles album cover. So that when Brian Epstein said to me, do you have any ideas of what to do with the cover? I thought of this image and adapted it to the situation with what the Beatles wore and made their faces whiter with a dark background. So these were three well-known graphic designers. On to the next. Well, there's the clean image of with the Beatles. Hard Day's Night. United Artists had presented a very strange and rather complicated cartoon drawing of four Whigs playing guitars. I said to the producer, Walter Shenson, who asked me what I thought, I said I didn't really think it reflected either the level of the Beatles nor really what they were about. So he said, well, can you come up with anything? So I came up with this idea because I couldn't think of one image that represented the animation that they gave to that film. This was the one taken in the park in half an hour at the end of the day. I say half an hour because that's all I had for the light. The sun is going down. I knew that this was what they call the magic hour, photographically, when you get that warm light. I used a telephoto lens, kept it wide open so the background would go out of focus. So it was a risky shot, handheld, done in a very short period of time. After I'd taken the photograph, I saw the autumn leaves on the ground, because we're now in October. So although it looks warm as an image, they had to wear overcoats to keep warm. I saw these autumn leaves on the ground and decided to climb a tree and get a shot of them down from the tree, looking down with the autumn leaves in the background. This, in black and white, ends the book, but it was used as a cover in color for an album called Early Beatles Hits in America. And this was the source of the idea for the Help album cover. This was on location in Austria, and I decided to adapt this to a semaphore, which is what sailors used before email, to indicate from one boat to another what they had to do, where they had to go, etc. Semaphore, which were arm movements signaling single letterings. So I wanted to spell help in this semaphore fashion, but graphically it didn't look interesting. So I had to improvise, and you can't see it here, of course, but on the actual album cover, I just had them position their arms in a form that looked graphically interesting. And it came out to a very interesting word called NUYV. On to the next. This is a sepia version of the color version of Rubber Soul. I can never quite get the color to look how I wanted it to look, but because nobody would spend the money on getting the treatment you'd have Photoshop nowadays, but I just couldn't get the treatment I wanted, or the look, the contrast. So in the book I put it in sepia, which I feel reflects what I was really trying to get. It's interesting that John, who was the first to leave the land of the living, is looking at camera. This was a night when John and I went out on the town, came back drunk, and he said, the van's coming to pick me up in an hour. I was too drunk to get up the stairs to my apartment, so he said, why don't you get in the back of the van, sleep it off, and come with us to Birmingham, which is in the center of England. And this was taken backstage in Birmingham in October '63. Paul in Idle Lane. This came about by chance. I didn't know there was an Idle Lane, but there was an area in London where I wanted to photograph them, and I just saw Idle Lane. So what do? Not put Paul there. On to the next. You see how handsome Ringo is. Robert Mitchum, move over. John Lennon with his sort of Greek sad look. And this impressive entrance was was my apartment, first apartment in London, and John moved in to live in the apartment above, 13 Emperor's Gate, which is now demolished. But John wanted to move to London with Cynthia and the child, and the mother-in-law was looking after the child, Julian, a lot. So the apartment was quite big, it was vacant, so I said, well, why didn't you have a look? So they moved in John lived above for about 6 months, and that was the time when we did his book together in his own right, the first book. He was very, very near living together. He was listening to my music downstairs, I was listening to his upstairs, but he was mostly on the sofa watching television. The doorway was Freeman on the left, flat 2, flat means apartment in England, and on the right, flat 3 was Hadley, which was the name he put, instead of putting obviously Lennon, because otherwise there would have been fans outside the door. But when limousines started to draw up for various reasons to take him to places, fans became aware, and then they started writing things on the walls. This was the entrance of John's first house in Weybridge. The suit of armour was in the hallway, the drawing was on the wall, so I just said, take the head off the suit of armour, move it over the drawing, stand behind, and that was typical John, where he was always disposed to improvise something that had a humorous, surreal feel. So in that sense, we worked well together, and you'll see a few other photographs that reflect that working attitude. This was a series of portraits taken for his first book cover, and the top left really shows the innocent, simple John. The innocent, simple John again, with a sense of humor, holding the rose, and the next one, I think, is I said, look, put the rose between your teeth, and being John, he does. So I got more characteristically humorous photographs with John, the most handsome ones with Ringo. George was very stylish and relaxed, and Paul, although he was theoretically the lead face of the group, he was good for the mums and the kids. John was the richest with his sense of humor. I think this shot is really the highlight of their whole career, getting off the plane on February the 7th in 1964 in New York. I had to push past them. I was on the floor, I was on the floor of the plane, so I got up and pushed past them to get down behind the pack of photographers, and with a telephoto lens got this shot reacting to the fans on the roof of what was then called Idlewild Airport. It's now Kennedy Airport. The photographer in the background is the famous Harry Benson, not getting the picture. Western Union, that's it's like the Pony Express. I took this Plaza, PL on the telephone, in my hotel room at the Plaza Hotel, where the telegram arrived. They sort of looked at it quickly, put it down, so I picked it up, took it to my room, and just for history, photographed it, because I think that's a great gesture of Elvis and his colonel to welcome the Beatles to America. The gentleman before was talking about the formation of Beatles on stage, and of course this was a classic formation where Paul, being a left-handed guitarist, goes off to the right, John's guitar goes off to the left, Ringo can be seen between the two guitarists, and George in the center either looks right or left towards John or Paul. A classic formation, very simple, and it was the music that counted, not anything else. There were very little movements, except that John would occasionally break into animated, sort of ridiculous, spastic movements just to do something different. This was taken from the Ed Sullivan Hotel on Miami Beach, with fans waiting to see them at the windows of their 20th floor suite. On the beach, saying farewell to America. In the sea, actually, on the beach. Then they went back to do Hard Day's Night, and this was taken outside the studio where they used to see the daily rushes. There was a montage on the wall outside the studio. And this was one of the sequences for the film where fans chased them into a station and then onto a train. And so you've got Ringo, then John, then George. Paul is not in that scene, and then the fans arrive, the girl falls, and the other fans trample over her in the last image on the right. And the chase continues inside the station until they get onto the train. If they used a disused station, because that was the only way they could control the filming. Dennis O'Dell did all that production, and Dennis did a very good job coordinating the hysteria of the situation and keeping a lot of people who were interested in watching the filming at bay, because the producer was becoming worried about the interference from people just watching out of curiosity. You see, Paul wasn't in that scene because he's supposed to be in disguise for something to do with the script. But he looks good. Ringo fooling around on set with a chorus girl for one of the sequences. In the bottom right, with less hair than the Beatles, is the director, Richard Lester, watching Ringo. That's Richard on the left again, Victor Spinetti, the actor, on the right, and Paul smiling at the cameraman saying, "Didn't you do a nice shot of me?" This was just part of the filming. Again, this was one of the shots I did for the title sequence at the end of the film, which I designed and produced. And in the book are all these portraits which have never been seen in a clear form before. And they form a whole sequence to the end of the chapter, Hard Day's Night. So we'll just see a small selection of these portraits. I love the simplicity. I proposed this for the album cover of the DVD, at least Martin Lewis, the producer, did, but they didn't seem to like it. They thought probably it wasn't animated enough, or they didn't look fresh enough, or they didn't look happy enough. So they used 3 very dull-looking profiles instead. That's George's head. He had the best hair. He agrees. Oh, he's not sure. You see, I got each one individually in the studio, and I just had to try and animate them. So I said, because I wanted a variety of expressions, so in the fast dissolves of the end title sequence to the music, Hard Day's Night, there was a sense of different facial expressions. So I had to try and get them to do as much facial expression as possible. George was, in fact, the most difficult. Paul didn't do too badly, but Ringo was a bit limited. He's listening to Paul. And Paul's not sure about his reaction. And John is seeing it carry his characteristic sense of humor. So I designed John's first book in his own right. I designed it just big enough so it fitted into a pocket. So it was literally a pocket book, so that people could carry it around and read it in moments of relief. And this was his second book in 1965. It's really, the design is a play on words. A Spaniard, okay, you put on a Spanish hat, a bullfighter's cloak, and a spanner in the works is an English phrase. I don't know if it's an American phrase, but it means there's trouble. There's a spanner in the works. So I happen to have a big spanner, because I had a car at that time. And so we combined the Andalusian look, the Spanish look, with the spanner to evoke a Spaniard in the works. This is Ringo being married to Maureen. Cynthia is on the left. John and George and Brian, I think, got a little high with a little help from their friends before going to the wedding, because they weren't used to very formal occasions. This is Brian presenting Ringo to the bride. And this is Ringo and Maureen with their family afterwards in the lawyer's apartment. And I just did a little romantic profile shot, because I think, well, obviously Ringo had an interesting profile, but it just gave a nice flavor to the end of the wedding ceremony. So then we're on to the filming of Help in the Bahamas, and this was on the estate of an American millionaire who owned the island they were shooting on. So these images mix Austria with Bahamas, hot and cold. That looks like Ringo at the top, or is supposed to look like Ringo, but in fact is a stunt man who had to fall off when the toboggan raced down the hill. This is the Beatles as they really should have looked. And a skiing sequence. Underwater, well, Ringo, George, and in the middle, Victor Spinetti, one of the actors in the film. Paul looking good, huh? Yeah. It kind of reminds you of some Hollywood actors. Maybe there are still young actors who look like that, but he got it together then. This was one of the absurd sequences from the film. And I don't know if you've seen many photographs of the Beatles underwater, but this is one of them. And I got it because I was at the filming above the swimming pool, and there was a scene where they come up from below. So they have to go down to come up. But of course there was no filming of them down. But I saw these little porthole windows. So I raced down into the basement of the hotel, found where the swimming pool was, and since they had to do the shot several times, I was just lucky enough to get one where they more or less all looked pretty good. Paul on a bicycle, relaxed, waiting for the shooting. George smoking a cigarette with other herbal substances in it. And Ringo again waiting for action. And John, with his typical characteristic sense of humor, puts a machete in his mouth and dances with one of the principal character actors. Well, this is the central figure statue of the film. That's on the right is Malcolm Evans putting his goggles on, about to swim off into the sea for the last scene of the film. And this is on Paradise Beach, and is again the last sequences of the shooting on Paradise Island. So I think really this captures in a way the spirit of the Beatles as a foursome, and I think they really enjoyed their time together in the chalet on Paradise Island, which used to be called Hog Island. Hog is a male pig, and that's what the Buccaneers called that island when they used it as a base for their adventures. I took a series of portraits for a promotional album booklet for a tour in America. This was John in his painting studio in his home. Paul with his Elvis look. Elvis was always Paul's hero, his idol. And George, relaxed, cool, a kind of Kevin Costner, I suppose, of the Beatles. And I'm glad Rolling Stone used this as the cover for their commemorative issue to George Harrison, who I really liked as one of the Beatles. I liked his quietness, his dry sense of humor, and his warmth of character. And this was the lady, Patty, he first fell in love with and married. And I used to work with her as a fashion model. She was a lovely character, still is, and I'm still in touch with her and sending her pictures of herself that she hasn't seen even. This is George in the mirror with Patty just after they'd been married in the home of their new house. Now there's a story. Music towards the message, please. Music department. Okay, hang on a moment. Now this, I'm afraid this is a shot of me, but it was taken on an island near Hong Kong called Macau. At that time I was living in Hong Kong. I lived there for 9 years. And I'd learned that George had come over to visit the shooting of Shanghai Surprise with Madonna and Sean Penn, which was about an hour and a half away from Hong Kong. So I sent George this picture with a note saying, without putting my name, I said, give me a call when you have time. It would be nice to come over and meet you. So unfortunately, I was away. He didn't get, it took him ages to work out who it was. So now listen to the 2 messages he left on my answering machine in Hong Kong.
This is George Harrison. Anyway, it took me days to figure out who you are. You got a groovy shirt on the picture. Anyway, I'll try your other number. If I don't get you anyway, all the best. And it's a surprise to find you living in Hong Kong. All the best. Bye-bye. Rob, or Robert, as you used to be known, it's George Harrison again. Anyway, I'm leaving in an hour. I just thought maybe I'd have a talk to you, but anyway, all the best. It's nice to know that you're still alive and kicking, and I like your shirt. All the best to you, Squire. Bye-bye.
Thank you, George. I really like his voice, and I'm going to send that tape to Olivia, so that she can hear George's voice in his quiet, mellifluous manner. Get this guy off the screen. Next image. This is George in one of the last portraits I took of him. Ringo with a Roman bust at the bottom. This was an album I designed but was rejected for Revolver. I gave them more or less an idea of what the montage would be, but they didn't quite didn't get the idea of a montage. They didn't really want a montage. So I liked it so much I completed it. And the other day I thought, well, why the hell not? Just put the Beatles and Revolver on, because I can then put it in my portfolio as one of the many rejected albums. And the next image that is coming up is also been a rejected album. I had a title for the album in the bottom left-hand corner, and maybe some of you could think what it might be. It was actually Fuck You Too. This is another album cover I designed the other week for a Spanish artist who I read an article in the newspaper. I did his previous album cover that when he was recording, there was a cockerel outside that wouldn't stop. So they integrated the cockerel into the soundtrack. So I proposed to Raimundo that he did a song called whatever, cock-a-doodle-doo, which is the cacareo is the Spanish for cock-a-doodle-doo. That they had a song called cock-a-doodle-doo, and they mixed it, the sound of the cockerel, with the singer. So there was actually a song called the title of the album, and this is a portrait I did of a very fine cockerel in the Philippines. So this is George with very high-tech earphones recording Revolver. John listening. Mick visiting. Listening to the mix with John and Paul. Malcolm making tea in the background. Ringo, poor Ringo, he lays down the drum tracks and then he has to wait and wait and wait. So this is a typical Ringo position during the recording. So you can see how the technology is changing. There's the word Fender there on the bottom right. I think that's a guitar, isn't it? A Fender? Or is it a sound system? I don't know. But anyway, what? Oh, they're both. Okay, well done. Anyway, there's John playing a guitar and Paul playing a guitar you can't see. But I mean, a very different atmosphere to what we saw earlier. And this was when they were really into recording music in the studio. This is a closer shot so that anybody interested in guitars can see what he's playing. And also John's attitude, which was always the left foot forward and the knee bend. That was his characteristic stance for playing like in the studio. And this was the shot I talked about, climbing the tree to get the leaves in the background, and is the last shot in the book. And the text that goes with this image is entitled The Last Word. So I just summarize my feelings of being in the eye of the hurricane with the Beatles and more or less what it represented. And since John was the one I was closest to, I let him have the last word. And the last word was him talking about the experience of being a Beatle. And it ends with him saying, you do this and you finish. And so the book ends with the word finish by John, who was the first to leave us. I'm sorry, this is me again. This goes with the credits at the end of the book. A self-portrait recently taken. And now the back cover of the book is the Boots saying farewell to the Beatles, with Paul's quote at the top saying, I have a feeling Bob's photographs were amongst the best ever taken of the Beatles. So thank you, Paul. And then a summary of me at the bottom. I actually did 7 album covers for the Beatles, because I did with the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Help, Rubber Soul, Long Tall Sally, and the Beatles' early hits. So I think that makes 7, plus the one that was rejected makes 8, if you want to count one more. So I think that's about as much as I can say about the Beatles. And would we come back to the music so that we could round off the evening listening again to Paul singing live an American song, which they always recorded up-tempo on George Martin's advice. And here is Paul singing Kansas City.